Hi, my name's Eric. I'm one of the guys who's just completed Train the Trainer, and I've found the 6 sessions incredibly helpful. The content has allowed me to think about asking helpful questions, to develop a culture in my groups where people are learning and being vulnerable, and to train planters to plan, implement and sustain gospel growth.
The past 12 weeks or so have been incredible. The material we went through has been brilliant. The online sessions have been great. I, up to this point, have existed in largely the kind of teacher-preacher mode, where when I try to communicate or teach something, it's usually delivered with me just speaking at a group of people, and them listening and hopefully absorbing some of what I've had to say. This
material has really challenged me, and I just made an announcement just 2 weeks ago at the church service that we're going to revamp the church's training program. And we're going to move into much more of discussions and application and just where they are really discussing these things and putting into practice these principles that we've been learning here.
It's encouraging to understand that it's not our job as trainers to simply lecture and teach the material, but to create a learning environment in which all of the participants engage and work collectively in order to achieve new information that can be immediately applied in the ministry context.
I remember one of the phrases that stuck, it's still stuck in my mind. It is that, and it is pure gospel, is that the transformation, the church planter transformation, is not depend on us. It's depend on Christ's work.
We always have started our sessions with applying the gospel to our hearts. We can only teach people as deep as we go ourselves. So as we have been together in this great fellowship with wonderful men, and it's been encouraging for me to be with you, and also as I've seen you apply the gospel to your hearts, and it has taught me how to apply the gospel to my heart as well.
You know, I came thinking I'm actually a pretty good trainer, and then I go, actually, I think I was a pretty decent teacher, but I knew nothing about training. And after coming through this, I see such a big contrast between just teaching and training, that there are two different goals. Teaching is part of training, but you can teach and yet not train. And so after going through this with you guys, I really feel at least like the concepts are so much more clear.
It's also provided me with a cohort of like-minded pastors who want to start gospel movements in their cities. And as we share our experiences and the skills that we're developing, it's really encouraging me to continue to spur on to see more people come to know Jesus in my city.
The vision of City Europe is to create movements of the gospel in the cities of Europe. The vision basically describes why we exist. Why do we exist? Well, we do exist because we feel called to the cities of Europe to create movements of the gospel there through church planting. The 21st century is a time when more and more people live in cities, and we see that at the same time, church feels less and less able to do church or to apply the gospel into a young, urban, post-Christian, post-modern, post-secular society. And we do feel called to go to those places and to plant new churches. This is what City was all about from the beginning. Why we exist, why we started what we started. Because some leaders felt called to go to urban places in Europe to create movements of the gospel. Through church planting, this is our very specific contribution. We think a movement of the gospel is more than church planting in the city, but we feel called to contribute the planting of healthy new churches, then in collaboration with the existing churches to seek a movement of the gospel in the city. Our dream, basically, so what we dream and pray about is that we want to see revival. Revival in every city in Europe, in every country. We do believe if we started in the cities, then it will spread out through the whole country, through the whole Europe. And this is what we do. We do train and mentor and equip and coach people who become church planters, who then create churches in order to seek a movement of the gospel in the city and to change the whole city with the gospel. So we exist basically to create those movements of the gospel. And if one day in the future, every city in Europe has a self-running, owned by local people, movement of the gospel through church planting within it, then city doesn't need to exist anymore. But until that day, it needs a network or a movement like City to help those people to create those movements of the gospel. This is the vision of City Europe. Well, City Europe is all about helping people who have a shared vision or want to achieve something that they need help with. So it is, if you want to plant a church, either you are a church planter or someone who wants to be part of a church planting project, or if you and your church have the vision to plant a church, to send someone out to plant a church in a city, maybe in your city or another city, then City Europe can help you. We are able to help you to first connect you to other leaders in your city or region to get some support there in relationship, in asking questions, in a learning community and something like that. We can help you through the way we train you, how we connect you with a gospel coach, how there's a lot of material, a lot of things that we can help you with specific question, but mainly it is a lot about the relationships. So we can help you to connect you with other people all over Europe or in your city or in your region that help you to plant that church. We believe if you want to plant a church in a city in Europe, then you shouldn't do that alone. You shouldn't do that alone on your own. You need a team, and your team and you need some people around you that support you. So in the best case, you need someone who becomes your mentor, and you're kind of an apprentice or a trainee. You need a trainer or someone who, or in the best case, actually, there's a learning community that gets trained by someone who's an equipped trainer, and you need a gospel coach. So these are the three relationships that are at least the ones that we would suggest. Sometimes they're not there, but that would be the best case scenario. Saying all of that, we want to support people who want to plant churches or who want to send out church planters, and all the way from identifying, assessing, training, coaching, mentoring, sending out, supporting, multiplying a church. All of that, we want to be a supportive network and movement around that path. And we're quite experienced, and I think we have high quality material and good trained people who can help you on the way. And if you think that is something we can help you with, just connect through our website, connect through our social media, or connect locally with the leaders who are part of City Europe. And we are very eager to help everyone possible who is about creating movements of the gospel in the cities of Europe through planting churches.
that you have today logged into our call. This is the third live, or I think fourth live conversation of the evangelism project from City Europe. And we're very happy to have you with us on this conversation. Today, I have three guests. It is Tiago Cavaco from Lisbon, there's Tim Vreugdenhil from Amsterdam, and Daniel Bartz from Hamburg. Thank you for joining. And we will have a conversation about an interesting topic, which is around the idea about how do we share the gospel. It is more a conversation about in depth. We want to think about how is the European mindset weakening our understanding of the gospel. So why is it that if Europeans having a hard time sometimes to understand and believe the gospel, which sometimes happens, why is that? If there's something specific about us in Europe that makes it kind of hard. And yeah, this conversation, as I said, is a little series of talks, and they all circle around the question of how can we share the gospel with people in Europe in a way that they actually like it, or they want to hear more about it. That's our hope. And we have a group of leaders, which my three guests today are a part of, and I'm very happy to host today this conversation. One last thing before we start. If you watch this on Facebook or YouTube, you will have the opportunity to ask a question. And after the first 30 minutes of our conversation, you can, we will then take some of the questions and I will ask them to my three guests. So if you have an idea about something you want to ask, please put it in the chat there. And then we will get the questions here and I will be able to ask them after 30 minutes. So please be active and put them in the chat. So I want to begin with more a funny question, and that is the three of you, I know you have a family, and with the corona situation right now, you're mainly at home. There's a funny video on the internet, I don't know if you saw that, which is basically a guy and he gets a question from a voice that goes like this. It says, so what would you rather do? Option A, quarantine at home with your wife and kids, or B? And he immediately says B. I don't know if you saw that video. I don't know, it reveals a little bit of a challenge that many of us experiencing this day. I know that you all are husbands and dads of kids. Is it that bad right now in your home, or is it can you still handle it? Daniel.
I would say my kids are behaving perfectly fine.
Yeah.
They are siblings of Jesus, I would say. So there's no problem. I would totally choose A.
Yeah, okay.
Not.
How's it in Lisbon?
So it's the second time that we are facing a more kind of radical lockdown. And unfortunately, right now, Portugal is the worst country in the world in terms of coronavirus things going on.
Yeah.
But I would say that comparing with the first lockdown almost 1 year ago, we are not exactly in a harmony stage yet. Yeah, we're not exactly there, but probably last year was more difficult. I would say that. So there's hope.
Tim, how is it in your home?
So I would definitely have chosen the B scenario. I was prepared for difficult times, and yes, they are difficult. We are in lockdown for 6 weeks now, I think. But if you see this, I try to show this to you. This is what I produced today with my 5-year-old son.
That's what you did, Tim? That's great.
His teacher gave an instruction video. I never produced in my lifetime. And then once you're sitting to your next to your son, and you have a very good feeling after produce this one. So I think this period of time has its special blessings. I think I'll keep this in mind. That I made this.
Yeah, great. I can definitely relate to that. We have 3 kids at home as well. It is good, but we're sometimes looking forward to times when this whole thing is over. So there's a challenge right now that many people in Europe are experiencing around the corona time. So the challenge of Europeans, let's move that to our main topic, sharing the gospel. So there are some challenges about Europeans, about the European mindset, the European culture with the gospel. And I do want to ask the first series of questions, linking them a little bit to some historical events, going through the three countries or cities that you live in. So I will begin with the most early one, and that is with Tim. One of the guys that in the 17th century came to your country and to your city, Amsterdam, was Spinoza. And he was one of those philosophers and of the Enlightenment, which still has a deep impact. So how does all that, maybe in your city or for us as Europeans, create a challenge to understand the gospel?
Yeah, I think you can say many good things about Spinoza. He's of course a landsman of Tiago, so he came from Portugal originally. And then he found a safe place in the 17th century here in Amsterdam. And besides our city hall, there's a big statue of Spinoza. So he's literally one of the saints of the modern Amsterdam. I think many people, including me, do admire the guy because of his uncompromised sense of freedom. So he wanted to think through everything. And I think he influenced European mind deeply in giving an example that there are actually no borders in Europe's thinking. I think maybe he's very influential, especially today, because he defended the thesis that God is in everything. And I think this resonates with a lot of modern Amsterdam people. Which is an interesting idea, but it is also quite far away from something like the gospel. So, very interesting guy, this Spinoza. We should read more Spinoza, I think.
Yeah, and it created probably a lot of challenges. Then moving a little bit forward in time into 1755, there was a huge event in Lisbon, a huge earthquake, which kind of resolved in an interesting way into a theological or philosophical question in Europe. It is about, is God actually good? So could he actually be good when he allows something that bad to happen? And it was like a big historical event, Tiago. Mm-hmm. Is that still something that shapes Europeans or kind of hinders them in the way of understanding the gospel? Do you see the line still there?
It's interesting because when the earthquake, it was 1755, when it happened, it really shook, it literally shook all Europe. Voltaire wrote about that. It's interesting that after so many centuries, I would say that definitely in a Portuguese setting, we do think a lot about it. Probably not in a very, probably we don't frame it so much theologically in a systematic way. Mm-hmm. But for instance, here in Portugal, one of the things that I think the big earthquake contributed to is that a sense of fatalism. It's a very Portuguese thing, probably a more Southern European thing, a sense of fatalism that whenever a big tragedy happens, in the back of our minds, we are thinking, oh, this is the big tragedy I was heading for. So this is the real meaning of my existence now that I'm going through a big tragedy. Of course, thank God, since that big earthquake, there was not any earthquake compared to that one. But there's a sense of when a tragedy happens, it's like if there's a meaning in life, it's way more connected to a big tragedy than to a big thing happen in a positive way. Yes.
Do you see that also, Tiago, if I may ask you a question, do you see that in a crisis like this, in the pandemic, mm-hmm. do you see as a strand of this way of thinking in,
yes.
in the way Portuguese people mm-hmm. respond to what's going on?
I don't think it's a conscious thing, and that's why when we think about our own culture, probably sometimes the bigger lessons are not the ones that we have been thinking about, but are the things that we discovered when we were not supposed to get to that conclusion. But for instance, I do believe that when the coronavirus struck, in a very Portuguese way, there's a kind of passivity, a kind of conformity. We are not that known for struggling against authority when things go bad. In a way, it's like there's a sleeping previous acceptance of when things go wrong. And it's like we were built to accept the tragedies. And so I think there's a something going on. And of course, I'm grateful to God that right now, for instance, there's social order in Portugal. In Tim, you're in Holland, and things have been wild in the last days. I'm happy that we are not going through that, and I hope we are not going through some kind of riots or something like that. But I do believe that there's something that has to do with the big earthquake about us not, of course, we are not wishing for tragedies, but when they happen, we feel that they are more realistic about what life is.
Okay. Well, let's move to Daniel. The big tragedy that in our country or all over Europe happened were looking back to a whole century that was shaped by wars that had something to do with Germany, of course, and in a very bad way. So did that shape in some way the way Europeans look at the gospel, or does it have an influence on us as Europeans coming out of a century that has these two world wars? Do you see still streams of that and influence in the way when people try to understand or explain the gospel, how that is maybe challenging?
I would say definitely the wars in Germany or in Europe. You would say in Europe. I mean, World War II basically cost 35 million people. I mean, their lives in Europe. And I would say the lessons learned in Europe, which came out of World War II, are very different in Britain than in Germany, for example. So I would say yes, Europe was shaped by that, and European thinking was totally shaped by that. But I would also guess that it was shaped very differently in Germany or France or Britain, or maybe even Russia or Poland or something. So,
Sure.
And having said that, I would say that talking about a European mindset is quite challenging because you have
That's
so
true.
many different countries with different nationalities, with different languages, with different histories a little. And of course, there are some major events in all of Europe, like for example, World War II, which had different outcomes. Like for example, Germany basically started it, and because of that, and then they lost, or we lost as a German nation, and because of that, Germany was made to think about a reconciliation of what happened. Was basically, there was this huge movement of working on our past, working on our regressions, on our sins and all that, which basically led up to World War II. But basically what happened in World War II was way worse, and we had to, and still until today, work on the basically on the transgressions of what happened over in World War II. And that might have looked a little different in other countries, I think. So it's very complex.
Yeah, very good. Well, then I think what are things that you would say maybe they're different in Europe, but all three of you, what are the things that makes a European mindset? I know that something like that doesn't really exist because it's so different. But what are the things that are so challenging for us as Europeans when we think about understanding the gospel or even sharing it?
Well, let me start with something that's maybe a little bit funny. I read this point one time in the book of a philosopher named Ivan Ilich, and I try to explain this as clear as I can. And this Ilich says, especially the western part of Europe came so far in the Christian road, and he uses the story of the Good Samaritan as an example. So he says this way of behaving, doing the right things for your neighbors, starting hospitals all over the place, taking care of people, that's so much part of our common knowledge. And he says that's part of Christianity. It has a Christian background, but at some point we Europeans started to believe that we can do the whole thing without a faith basis or a gospel or whatever. And I think there's much truth in this way of looking after secular Europe. It is not chaotic. It is not anti-moral. There are many good things as under Christian influence, but at some point we made a decision. We don't need the whole tradition. We can just do it on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, and I would totally add to that with some other philosophers in European thinking, like, and especially German thinking, it's Nietzsche, who argued that God is dead and basically brought that whole atheism topic, or the mindset thinking without God to a whole other another level. And because Nietzsche argued God is dead, we didn't have a God anymore, but we still needed moral values, right? So then Kant comes along, brings in the category of interpretive, kategorischen Imperativ.
It's a German,
He's
yeah.
German, so I can use the German word. So he comes up with this, with the law of, how you treat your neighbor, that's how you want to be treated and all that. And so we come up with our own values and trying to be a good person, doing all these good deeds to save ourselves, basically. And especially after World War II, I mean, this whole thing is really, you can connect the dots really easy, actually, if you see the big picture, so to speak. So there's no God anymore. We need something new, and we come up with something new. And the interesting thing is, then every nation has a little distinctives in terms of what does it mean for your nation, for your mentality, to be the good Samaritan or the good person who saves itself. And that's funny. So what is it for the Dutch people? What is it for the Portuguese people? What would you say?
I would say for us as a people, it's a slight sort of moral superiority, in which we all the time surprise ourselves that we are not that superior that we thought we would be. But there is something in our common narrative that we have to work together. We fought the fights against the waters and so on. So we are a little bit ahead on other countries. We never started a war over the last 3 centuries. So if you tell yourself that story as a country, you think, well, we are quite good in a moral sense.
Which means for the gospel that we don't need to be saved, or we don't need a good news anymore. Is that the challenge?
Yeah, that's absolutely the challenge. So compared to the riots, Tiago was referring to the riots that happened over the last 3 nights here in Holland. Then our prime minister is on television, and he's a smart guy and a liberal, and he says, "People, behave yourselves." End of the story. And everybody said, well, that's great that he said behave yourself. So that includes a sort of a way of thinking that every normal person is able to behave him or herself.
Okay, Daniel, what is the challenge for the Germans or the people?
Maybe let
Sure.
Tiago wanted to say something.
No, it was nothing specially smart, but I was listening to you, and one of the guys that finds the bug into this humanistic approach is that there's a great book from a British guy called John Gray. It's called 7 Types of Atheism. He writes in that book, he talks about Spinoza, for instance, and he goes, and he's really good talking about Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was not celebrating the birth of a new humanity without God based on morals. His kind of approach was a new morality that would say goodbye to the slave morality of Judeo-Christianity, something like that. And so one of the good things is that when John Gray talks about Nietzsche, he says that lots of people right now love to jump on the Nietzsche bandwagon, but Nietzsche would be really ashamed of them because he was never about a new kind of a new kind of man striving to be good. Nietzsche would say that that was Christian junk. He was not that interested on that. So, for instance, when you read another guy like Charles Taylor, and I have never read Taylor directly, I read James K.A. Smith writing about Charles Taylor in A Secular Age. And one of the things that Charles Taylor said is that our secularized societies, in a way, are Christianity conquering all. And it conquered so much that right now people want to be good, not because of what Christianity taught, not because of Christ, but because they got a way of being Christ without Christ, something like that. So even our secularization, it was a kind of backwards victory of Christianity, which brings us to a harder place. Is that we have to try to explain that it doesn't make that sense, like Danielle and Tim were saying. Doesn't make that sense trying to be good when there is no God. And yeah, that's interesting for me. It goes on being puzzling. I'm puzzled by the way that people try to be good without even acknowledging some kind of a real pattern of good or evil.
And the challenge is then in that for the gospel that it's not necessary anymore because it's already all the benefits of it already there.
Yeah.
Is that the challenge for many Europeans to say?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's the number one challenge, because if I have, let's say I need coffee or I need milk, and if it's in my storage here, I have 10 bottles of milk standing here, and then somebody rings at my door and says, I want to offer your milk. I would be surprised and say, well, listen, I already got it. So if you think that one of the great promises of Christianity is to give you liberty, real liberty, there's liberation at stake. All of my secular friends would immediately answer, what do you mean? We are part of the most liberal,
right? We got it already.
Most liberal city in the world. So what do you want to sell me? Yeah,
that's true. But Daniel, you said in our previous conversation that in the German mindset, there's something, we achieved it by working so hard, and we have a standard of life, which can also be a kind of a challenge to the gospel.
Yes, totally. I mean, before I get into that, I really find it fascinating what Tiago just said, because, the Nietzsche bandwagon. So Nietzsche was really not about inventing a new humanistic approach on how to live, but he was trying to really free himself from the shackles of a Christian or Judaism law. So he didn't want the law anymore. So, but if you don't have that anymore, right? If you don't have God's law or the good living or moral standards or whatever, you just get rid of that, then you don't need Jesus anymore. You don't need the gospel in any sense anymore, right? So he kicked out, like he kicked out the gospel, he kicked out everything, just by getting rid of God's restriction or whatever, and the good life God wanted to have for us. So and that's the beginning, and that's fascinating. If you think about this a little deeper and a little more, there are some great implications, because today people would say, if you come to them and talk to them about Jesus, right, about God, then everybody is like, we don't want that anymore. We don't want the restrictions anymore. The first thing they're thinking about, when you're talking about Christianity church or about Jesus, then they are thinking the first thing is about the Ten Commandments and the law and what you have to do to be saved, right? And this is, I mean, this is true pretty much in our city, that when you try to talk to people about God and all that, that's their biggest concern, that they are pressed into a straitjacket of what they have to do, and so because that's their opinion about Christianity, they're not even getting to the point of the gospel, which is so freeing and liberating. So their point of view is, we don't want that anymore, and if we don't have that anymore, then we are free. And that's a totally, of course, that's a one-way so Sackgasse. So you don't get far with that. One way, so you don't get far with that.
Maybe, guys, before we now, so we'll have to look a bit at the time. So in a couple of minutes, we will be able to receive some questions from everybody. So let me remind everybody who's watching us, you can type a question into the chat, and if in a couple of minutes we will ask them to our people here, my friends. And but before we do that, we have analyzed a lot about the challenge. But before we then get all the questions, I do want to have a final statement from you. Well, if it is so tricky for Europeans to, have all these obstacles towards the gospel, is there actually something that brings you hope? So if it is challenging to understand the gospel as a typical European, so to say, I know that nothing like that exists, but what is maybe one thing about how Europeans think, and that today brings you, not only do you think it's problematic, but it's also hopeful for Europeans to look at the gospel and actually maybe like it? I don't know, each one of you, maybe, what is it?
I was thinking, listening to Daniel, at the same time, I was thinking that it can work like a paradox, because in some ways, our getting rid of God has made us way more legalistic. Even thinking about the places, and this is not a compliment nor a curse, but thinking about the Netherlands or even Germany, with that aura of being very open-minded countries, I guess it's pretty grim if you're not an enlightened guy in a place like that. So I think one of the great things that the gospel will show is that being good without God is such a burden, that the same way that the Christians were portrayed as atheists at the beginning of the Christian century, there's a kind of new atheism that people will point at us, because we will sound even relativistic in an age where people are betting so much on being good, or because they are woke, or because they are conservative, or because they are left, or because they are right. But I think that in some way, Christianity will sound new, because it's not up to you to being able to even fulfill your best desires as a human being. And so it can work in like a paradox. I really believe, and that this is hope. This is hope, I think.
Yeah. Daniel, why do you think there's hope?
I say, in the end, every European nation is trying to save itself in their distinctive way, and that's they are not going to succeed. So, and the gospel is the answer of, it's not what you do, not what you try to do, not what you achieve as a nation, not your distinctives, not how good you are, but how good someone else was. And the works of Jesus Christ saved you, nothing else. And proclaim that in new words, in those distinctives, in every nation. That's going to liberate, and that's going to save, and that's going to enlighten you in the end. And that's my biggest hope, man. The gospel of grace.
Yeah, very good. Tim, why do you think there's hope?
We started with Spinoza, but we have another saint here in Amsterdam. That's Rembrandt, the big painter. So let's imagine that we would hide all the paintings Rembrandt has made for about 100 years. So there are 60 of them here in the Rijksmuseum. We take them, we'll hide them, and we'll never show them to anyone for about 100 years. And then at once we bring them back into the playing field. Now you can expect you can expect how people would react. They would be bewildered about this sort of beauty they had forgotten. They didn't know that it was there. I think the Saint Charles Taylor that Tiago was referring to makes a great point, and that gives me hope day by day, that we late modern Europeans, we tend to forget the beauty of moral and spiritual sources, the beauty of moral and spiritual stories, and that's what I see all the time that I use these materials here in Amsterdam. You can tell the story of the Good Samaritan to very good, well-educated people, and they are surprised by the beauty of their story. They simply didn't know that it exists. So I think in our toolkit there are great materials, and let's show them to the people, and leave the rest to God, to what He likes to do in people's lives.
Good. So thank you. That is very helpful. So the idea of beauty that will unreal again, I think that is very inviting for Europeans. That's true. We have now a couple of questions from the chat, and I will ask them to you, and you're free to answer in a short way. So the first one is, there's a legacy of the church in Europe, which sometimes can be a challenge even for the gospel. So that there is a church, or that there is a church history. How does that impact Europeans' approach to the gospel? Probably in a different, the question is asked in a way that it's probably different in countries that are more shaped by Roman Catholic, which probably would be more Tiago's answer, and Protestant nations, which would be more Tim and Daniel. So how does the legacy of the church is a challenge also?
So I'm thinking about in Portugal, more than 70% of people will say that they are Catholics. But there's a big difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, because in Catholicism, and I'm making a broad simplification, but in Catholicism, you have more room to belong and not behave, because you can be non-practicing. I know that in countries where the Reformation was big, there's room also for some kind of non-practice, but in Catholicism, it's even more natural. What does it mean when you say that you are Catholic, but you don't practice? I don't know either, but so more than 70% present themselves as Catholics, but they don't go to the Mass, they don't go to church, they only go there probably 2 times, 3 times, baptism, marriage, and then funeral. But one thing I do believe that you can extend to everyone, Catholic and non-Catholic, is that people would feel more poor if for some reason every Catholic church would come down. Let's, as a thought experiment, let's think that for some reason every church would come down. So people do, in Portugal at least, and I think in all of Europe, even when big old churches may seem like carcasses of some old time in some old Europe that's no longer, but people still feel that what it used to mean, they don't want it just to vanish. So there's this big room for the past. And in that sense, for instance, when comparing with Americans, with people coming from other countries, other continents, I always say that I believe that Europeans probably are past haunted. So, and it means that church has a big weight. Sometimes it's a negative one, but at the same time, people would not want to make it simply disappear, because it's really a big part of us. So I would say there's some room for trying to present our Christian faith, respecting the past, because Christianity is really important for we are in Europe, may we believe or not. But at the same time, framing faith as something that really belongs to the future, to the present and to the future. And that's where things get complicated, because we tend to be suspicious of hope, of joy, and all of that Tim and Danielle were talking about, the wars, and that explains a little bit why we are so afraid of hope.
Good.
Maybe let me add something. I think, and just a small thought was, I think we need to do the hard work of separating the content from the form. Both it's a church, the content of God's word and God himself and Jesus and the gospel and all these, and love and all these things, is the content of the church. And over the centuries we had that, when we used to have that, and it always pops up, and then we have revivals and all that. Fine, great, and we love it, and we need to lift that up. But then on the other side, we have to be careful and maybe even ask for forgiveness for some of the forms we had as a church. Because that's institution, that's people, that's power play, that's all these things which went wrong very terribly sometimes. And when we can, maybe we can have a separate these things and say, these are both churches, and one comes from God, and this is great. But as soon as the flawed humanity, the flawed Christians are part of it, then you have form, then you have strategies, vision, blah blah blah, and all that, and that's sometimes very flawed, and maybe that's going to help a little for the legacy of the church. The content is great, the form is sometimes very sinful.
Tim, you're from a very Protestant country, mainly. How is the legacy of the church challenge to the gospel and understanding there?
Well, I think that the heritage of the church for the typical Dutch generations that live now, they all have in mind that the church wants to forbid a lot of things. That's still, so that's this Protestant ethics or whatever it is. I think you have to take that serious, and I think that it's you can discuss about heritage for a very long time. I think every single one of us, whatever the circumstances, can be of more importance than the whole heritage of the church. So confronted with another person who needs your help, or who needs advice, or who needs a good word, if there is really something at stake, nobody talks about heritage. So what I mean is that for you have to take it serious, but it's also a little bit of a philosophical discussion at the moment. That it really means something what you say or what you do. You can simply do it as a Christian. Every Christian can do it, and I think that has the power that is much stronger than the whole heritage. I think not every, but most of the people here in Holland, as secular as they are admirers of Pope Francis. Nobody likes the certain aspects of the heritage of the Catholic Church, but the humble way of walking and talking of one single person, although he's of course in a front position, that can change the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one last question that I have is Europeans think of themselves as being very tolerant. So that's probably shapes out in different ways in Europe, but that's something we think of ourselves. How is that a challenge to the understanding of the gospel?
Ooh,
that's a deep one.
That's a deep one, and
we have just 5 minutes left. Sorry.
Long answer.
Try it short.
In terms of religion, you mean, or in terms of everything?
Doesn't say.
But yes, I mean, what comes to mind when you talk about tolerance and religion and the gospel is Gottfried Ephraim Lessing and his parable of, there are three blind people and they're trying to find, and there was always comes the guy who tells the story about, religion is no one has the truth and it's just a part of the truth, and so be tolerant for the other. But what we forget is that that even the guy who tells the story, he has everything, and he basically, in the name of tolerance, tries to wipe away everything else. So and when you of course Europeans are really like they love the idea of tolerance, but when it comes to religion, in the name of tolerance, and this is basically Foucault saying, Michel Foucault, who says, so every way of tolerance combined with religion is a grip to power, right? So if you say in the name of tolerance, everything is the same, every religion is the same, Christianity, blah, 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 then what you really do is, in the name of tolerance, you emerge your power, you emerge your position over everyone else. And that's a power play. Yeah. And so when it comes to religion and tolerance, I'm always reminded on Foucault and thinking, man, this guy really had it. And so using those arguments to really come down to the fake approach on tolerance helps a little. But what do you think? What do you guys think? This is just splashing out Foucault and blah, 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 all these guys, but it's much more complex and deeper than that.
It's
what
funny,
do you think?
We had Nietzsche and Kant and Foucault and Taylor.
Oh, yeah, it's deep, man. It's deep.
A lot of smart people in this conversation.
But I think to the topic of tolerance, I think it's a typical European idol, and it's especially a Dutch idol. Again, referring to the riots here in the streets over the last couple of days. So we are a very tolerant nation. We are tolerant for everything. But then some young guys plundering on the streets, then in the television shows and in the parliament, everybody says, these are criminals. We have to lock them up. We have to stop them. And all these sort of harsh texts. And here is, I think, an opportunity to speak about what grace or gospel really means. It doesn't mean that you say, I have no opinion about it, therefore it's too serious. But can you have a sort of empathy for young guys, especially growing up without fathers or in all sorts of social problems, and then being forced to do this way of behavior? I think that's the moment that our idol of tolerance is falling down immediately. And then we have to make the choice between absolute repression or things like empathy, love or grace or whatever you like to call them.
Very good.
Yeah.
That is almost like a perfect end. So the idea of grace is even stronger and liberating than the idea of tolerance. And people who are longing for tolerance and the value that's in it are in some way actually seeking for something that the gospel can offer even more. And that is the whole idea of grace and the love of God. Well, we're at the end of this. Thank you very much, Tim and Tiago and Daniel, for being part of our conversation today. This is, as I said, the fourth version of our virtual conversations. There will be more. You'll find them at our website, cityeurope.com, or on the YouTube and Facebook channel. And please leave your comments here. It's very helpful for us to understand how this is helpful or not for you. And people like Tim and Daniel and Tiago, we are working together on publishing some texts or some of these virtual conversations all around the topic of how could the gospel be something that could be made relevant for people in Europe again. So check out our blog with some things that were just posted this week, a text from a person in Athens. Our friend Giltis has published a good text. And please find out more about this. I'm very thankful for your participation today, and have a good evening wherever you're from in Europe. And the gospel is really the one thing that we want to bring to you as something. Find it out and spread it wherever you can into your own life and into your community and in a whole city. We do believe that there's nothing more beautiful and great than the gospel. And that's why we try to stress our thinking about that. So many greetings from here and from City City Europe, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Bye.